Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 11th chapter in the book of Exodus. This is the 10th and final plague. It is a short chapter of 10 verses, but before we want to comment on each one of those, we just want to review what the 9 preceding plagues were, the first of which we read in the 7th chapter. This is the blood, where Moses or Aaron raises his staff, I can't remember quite which one, and turns the Nile River into blood. So what was once water becomes fully blood, and the Nile was the center of Egyptian civilization. Without it was they may have not had quite a god for it, as far as I know, but they certainly worshipped the Nile itself. And the Pharaoh's magicians duplicate the miracle on, I guess, a cup of water. So he's not convinced yet. Then in the 8th chapter, we read of the 3rd through 5th, 2nd through 5th. We read of the frogs, the gnats, and the flies. So these are all animals that were visited Egypt, overwhelmed them with their presence, crept into every room, consumed every plant eventually. Well, that's getting a little far ahead of ourselves. Then in the 9th chapter, we read of the livestock, the boils, and the hail. And so the livestock of Egypt is targeted. This time, Yahweh's not only bringing animals into Egypt, one's not there and not wanted. He's also, at this point, killing the livestock, the animals themselves that belong to Egypt, while making a distinction all throughout. Now, during this entire time, neither the Hebrew peoples were scathed, but all of the Egyptians were scathed by these plagues. But Pharaoh, Moses was warned in anticipation of all this, that he would harden Pharaoh's heart throughout. So before the 10 commands, which we read of in the 20th chapter, came the 10 demands. These are witnesses of divine revelation, which take place in the scenery context of Moses and Pharaoh. And the boils, those are never pleasant to have. We read that Job was afflicted after Satan, at the permission of Elohim, had stolen all of his livestock, killed all his children, and then he's finally allowed to give him skin boils. But skin boils, just to get back to the chapter we're covering, are just not pleasant to have. They're not necessarily lethal, but that you exist in a maligned state of disease, deformity, and they're ugly to look at. And hail, now we read that some of the earlier animals that were sent consumed much of the crops. Egypt was an agriculturally dependent economy and civilization. The hail, which is something Egypt had never seen before, or perhaps even seen since, it rains roughly 3 times a year in the country of Egypt, but hail is an unprecedented and unduplicated form of precipitation to fall on that totally eliminates what crops are left. And the 10th chapter, we read of the 9th and 10th plague, the locust and the darkness. So the locust would have been people who ate what was left of that the hail didn't destroy. So at this point, all the fields, the once flourishing fields in Egypt, are naked and stripped, and Pharaoh's heart is still not hardened. And then a plague of darkness, which disables any man from seeing anyone or anything, and there's no way around it. In Egypt, they were smitten by darkness, while Israel enmeshed in light. So these plagues, these and demands, they showed the witness of Yahweh to his chosen people, as well as to the lands of Egypt and the lands around them. The Israelite rumor and their witness the rumor would precede them that this supreme deity had liberated them from slavery. They had a powerful ally in the sky that was something quite like none of them had, because they were prone to idol worship and polytheism. So their conception of deity were little more than the whims of a human imagination. And this, so what the 10th and final plague, this one actually hits Pharaoh straight in the home. So far we notice a progression of intensity, maybe not in a linear direction, but that's where we are at this point. So we're going to read with the opening verse. And Yahweh said to Moses, I am bringing yet one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt, and he is going to let you go from here. When he lets you go, he shall drive you out from here altogether. So Yahweh and Moses really have direct dialogue. They speak to one another face to face, as a friend speaks to their another. And Yahweh is telling Moses that this is going to be the final plague. After this point, he's not only going to let you go, but he's going to let you go permanently, and that means no more life of the slave or anything of that sort. And and speak now in the hearing of people, and let every man ask from his neighbor, and every woman from her neighbor, objects of silver and objects of gold. So this enslavement was revealed to Abram, as he was then known, in somewhere in Genesis 13 through 15, that his descendants would be slaves for 400 years. It was actually 430, but that doesn't in any way diminish the inerrancy of Scripture. But that his descendants would be enslaved and then enriched. So these payments were of the debt of the labor that they had performed to make Egypt the mightiest empire in the world at its time. Egypt was unrivaled as a military and cultural might during the New Kingdom period, and it was all because they had a class of slaves to give them this free labor to build all their mortars and monuments. So this was the due payment that was long overdue. They had been there some 430 years, and Yahweh also promises Moses something, the same thing he promises Abraham however many centuries ago. He tells him that they are going to depart from the land with many of the riches of Egypt. And Yahweh gave the people favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the eyes of Pharaoh's servants, and in the eyes of the people. So Yahweh gives his people grace as a visible testimony, not only to them, but also the Egyptians could see their nation being ruined, but these people in it, it's their deity that's ruining their nation, and they are unharmed by it, and they would have been thought of as lesser than being slaves by the average and ordinary Egyptian, but now they're in sudden awe. And even when all of Pharaoh's advisors tell him to just let these people go, look what you're doing to the nation with your stubbornness, he still won't do it. But it's going to be in the eyes of the Pharaoh himself, we read. And Moses said, Thus said Yahweh, about midnight I am going into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the lands of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of cattle. So there's going to be an extermination of every child of Egypt who has the misfortune to be the first born among them, that touches the top all the way to the bottom of society, from Pharaoh down to the lowliest of maids. So Pharaoh himself is finally going to be hit by one of these plagues in a very personal and poignant way, and he could see the power behind him, but he behind Moses, but refused to submit to it all throughout. He was a stubborn man. There's also a connection between the secondborn, and I recently discovered that Moses was not the firstborn. A careful rereading of Exodus told me it was the newborns who were set up to slaughter. Then I stumbled upon the realization when I read a passage elsewhere that said that Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 at this time. So Moses was a secondborn son, and there is an affinity between Yahweh and secondborns from Abel and Seth, all the way up to and beyond David, who was the eighth son of Childs. And the symbolism communicated through that typology is that it's an allusion to the second life. We all are born, but we all need to be born again in order to be saved. So that's the symbolism in my eyes. And there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as has never been or been again. An entire country reduced to wailing and tears is something that is going to emit a noise more voluminous than anything they've ever experienced or anyone would ever experience in the land of Egypt. We're talking about this entire society, from the Pharaoh down to the cattle, have the devastation of losing their firstborn in their midst. So that's why they're crying, and that's why it's so loud. But against any of the children of Israel, no dog shall move its tongue against man or against beast, so that you know that Yahweh makes distinctions between Egypt and Israel. So the entire time, Israel, who had been kind of on the loser end of existing in Egypt, they were the slaves. For once they find themselves winning, suddenly all these plagues and ruin and devastation is wrecking Egypt from top to bottom, and the Egyptians in it, yet they are untouched. So all throughout, Yahweh did protect and provide for his people, and the implication of this separation is found in the first sentence of the verse, because the distinction between Israel made, and the distinctions we learn more about in the 12th chapter, but and all these servants of yours shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, Get out, and you and all the people at your feet. And after that I shall go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in great displeasure. So we gather that somewhere he he departed the Pharaoh's physical presence in an angry mood, and he had every reason and right to be angry. And I don't know if he's speaking this to them, because it's not exactly clear. In the tail end of the previous chapter, we read that this would be the last time the two ever saw themselves face to face again. Pharaoh had imposed the ultimatum of the death penalty on Moses, who had visited his palace and petitioned on his people, and by this point would have been recognized as the man behind the miracles, which were really from above, but Moses was the human instrument and vessel through which they were done. But the earlier portion of the passage suggests that from top to bottom, they're going to beg you to leave. You've been begging to leave for 430 years to reclaim and resettle the land that was promised to Joseph, that you found, to Abraham, but they found relief in this land during the, thanks to the ingenuity of Joseph. And then we read eventually a Pharaoh ascended to the throne who knew not Joseph, and we have every reason to believe that that would have been Amhos the First, who was the founder of the 18th dynasty of Egypt, which would have witnessed the restoration of native control of the Egypt. So by the Middle Kingdom, what ended the Middle Kingdom was these people came from up north. They had chariots and horses. The Egyptians did not. They quickly overwhelmed them. And then eventually the natives acquired the horses and the cavalry and the strategies that they brought down, drove them out, and they were never quite the same again. So it's impossible to determine with precision, but it's not an implausible inference to imagine that Joseph would have served one of these Hyksos kings who would have been friendlier to foreigners like him than the xenophobia, which would have subsumed, often unfortunately comes with the rise in nationalism, the resurgence of nationalism. But Yahweh said to Moses, Pharaoh is not going to listen to you in order to multiply my wonders in the land of Egypt. So Pharaoh had not been listening to him the whole time. He had heard him, but he didn't listen. He didn't take him seriously. He was unmoved by the words of Moses, which came from Yahweh, who every promise that he heard from Moses of disaster that was going to strike, he often gives him a day grace period. He says, tomorrow I will do this, or tomorrow I will do that. But Pharaoh could not recognize or respond to the truth. And Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh. However, Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his land. So the entire time, Pharaoh was a hard-hearted man to begin with, and far from being convicted or even converted. We read a few times he confesses his sin out loud, but he's never moved to repentance. He is a hard-hearted man, and he finally would let this people go once the plague touched him in a personal way. And how Moses and Aaron did these wonders brings us all back to the 7th chapter, which witnesses Moses struggling to accept his divine commission as his spokesperson before Pharaoh and to the people he was going to lead into liberation on their journey to the promised land. But the important thing for us, Moses' personal problem was that he wasn't a gifted speaker, but he told him Aaron would function as his prophet, and he would be as Elohim to them. But we all have our problems, shortcomings, and deficiencies, which might make us afraid to even step a foot in the door of ministry. But we always have to remember that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And the called we read of in the first chapter are the weak, the foolish, and the despised, and etc. So he can transform even the unlikeliest of characters into uh, people who advance his kingdom in the life that they live. And I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. I'll see you then. Bye bye.